Hello, everybody. It's Thursday, December the 11th, 2025. Any December 11th, of course, reminds one of those tragic days on September 11th in 2001, almost a quarter of a century ago now. The images are still seared in us, and most of us were watching CNN. I certainly was. I will never forget being in Philadelphia and seeing the scenes, particularly the images of the second plane hitting the towers. And my guest today has particular memories of 9/11. Carol Lynn was the first American journalist to actually report on what happened on that catastrophic morning. She was in Atlanta working for CNN. And she has a new book out, which in many ways is built around a narrative, an autobiography, a story about her experience in the news business. When news breaks, she's joining us from Hawaii. Lucky lady to be there. I'm sure it's much warmer, Carol, in Hawaii than it is in California, and certainly much warmer in either California or Hawaii than it is on the East Coast. 9/11 for you must have been the most. Everyone talks about knowing exactly where they were when they first heard the news, but we all heard the news from you. Where were you?
I was at the CNN studios in Atlanta, which at the time was the global headquarters. I was anchoring a morning show. The network itself was at an inflection point in trying to face stiff competition against Fox News in the morning, as well as the traditional networks and the rising star of MSNBC. And so the morning of September 11th, none of us could predict that we were going to make history that day. We, at the time, were more concerned about a very slow news day. There was almost nothing going on. Michael Jordan was the top story. The Capitol building renovation was the next story. And we were really struggling to find headlines.
Let me revise that. Maybe I didn't make the question clear. When you think of that day and your experience in it, and I know your mind has gone back to it many times, and much of it is covered in your new book, When News Breaks. Is there a moment in your mind when you remember when you first heard about what happened? Was it an image on a screen? Did someone say to you something during a commercial break?
Andrew, the first time I heard about an attack on the World Trade Center, it was because a CNN executive was running behind me in the newsroom, and that never happens in the CNN newsroom. That newsroom is built for breaking news. The people in it, the producers, all of us live and breathe for the moment where we can throw out the scripts and just go with the story that's unfolding on the air. But we were in commercial break, and one of the executives was running behind me towards the control room. I was in a remote position in the newsroom, about to interview author Amy Tan about her new cartoon series, when all of a sudden they said in my earpiece, get to the set, get to the set. We're going into rolling coverage. There's unconfirmed reports that a plane has crashed into the World Trade Center. So that was my first indication that there was something big happening, but we had no idea how big. And of course, the first assumption is, Andrew, it's a small plane. It has to be a small plane. It has to be pilot error. Nothing else could possibly make sense. And once I got back to the anchor set and I looked in the what's called the preview monitor, and I saw the smoking, gaping, fiery hole in the World Trade Center tower, we knew that this was going to be different. And so the breaking news animation comes up. We're going live. We have no information other than what you are looking at on the screen right along with me.
And I have to admit, I watched some of the CNN clips before this conversation, and I'm not often chilled by what I watch, but I was chilled by that. And there seemed to be two moments. On the one hand, as you say, the first news when some plane crashed into the World Trade Center. Everyone assumed it was a small plane, and then it became clearer and clearer that it wasn't, that it was a passenger jet. And then, of course, the second moment when the second plane crashed and it was clear that this was not an accident. Are both those moments clear in your mind in terms of your memories?
Oh, crystal clear, crystal clear. We knew that we confirmed that it was a passenger jet because we had a phone interview with a vice president of finance, Sean Murtaugh, who was in New York and had a clear line of sight from the Turner Building high rise.
Yeah, and I was listening to him. He did a great job. I mean,
he did a terrific job.
What I like about what he did is that he didn't assume anything. Often he said, look, I just don't know because I can't see.
Right, but he saw a passenger jet, not a small plane. And that was our first confirmation that we were talking about a large passenger jet. So that was chilling in and of itself. So we see the fire, we see the hole, we get the confirmation that it's a large passenger jet. But it wasn't until the second plane hit that we knew it was terrorism.
And do you, where were you or what were you doing when you heard about the second plane? Do you have a very clear memory of that too? It wasn't another CNN executive screaming in the background?
No, it was, we did an anchor change. So the two other morning anchors took over the anchor set. I had just gotten off the set and I was standing with my show team in the middle of the newsroom. That was utter chaos. And then we all saw it. And it was, we just yelled. Everybody in the newsroom yelled. And then the energy just, you know, the place was on fire because, proverbially, of course, because all the editors were reaching out then to correspondents around the world. We were trying to get a perspective on who might have been the perpetrators, what are different bureaus, whether it's in London. We had Nick Robertson, who happened to be in Afghanistan on assignment. He was working his sources. But in the meantime, over the next hour, as you recall, just one thing after another was unfolding. And we were dealing with incoming information that we were not reporting because it was truly unconfirmed. We had a report that 10,000 body bags were being sent down to what would be ground zero, the World Trade Center site, which was giving an indication of what the city of New York thought was going to be the scale of death that they were facing down there. We heard that there was a car bomb outside of the State Department. That proved not to be true. We did know and reported that the White House was being evacuated. And we heard a number of reports of planes, additional planes being used as missiles in various sites targeted around the United States. We did not report that. That was not confirmed. So what our sense was we had a responsibility to the story. We had to take information as we were getting it. So we had to acknowledge what you were seeing on the screen, but we had to work our sources and our correspondents and our worldwide bureaus to actually get factual information, or at least people that we thought were credible sources to confirm what it is that they knew. What intel did we have in terms of who was going to take credit for these attacks?
Yeah, there were those moments of complete chaos and uncertainty. I remember as I said, I was in Philadelphia. I was watching on a hotel screen. I'd just come out of a business meeting. I was working for an internet startup at the time. And there was this scream by the crowd of people watching. And I remember for a few minutes or maybe an hour afterwards, we were in Philadelphia and nobody knew what was happening. I mean, it was quite conceivable, I guess, that a jet would crash into Philadelphia or New York or Washington, D.C., as you said, with all the rumors. Were you in any way, was there any security in Atlanta? Was there any concern that CNN might come under attack? Not
immediately, but obviously after you know, there were multiple events and multiple airplanes. And then we were hearing from our sources who, you know, it's not uncommon for intelligence sources and national security to pre-identify likely targets in the United States. So, you know, there was a moment, I don't know if you recall this, but there was a moment where every single plane in US airspace had to be grounded.
Yeah, I remember that.
Right?
Very clearly.
And you see, you can just imagine that visual of the air traffic controller screen where the lights just begin to disappear one at a time, and then it just goes silent. So that moment, the scope of time that these attacks unfolded, I think what you described, like your reaction and the people in your hotel, it was like a physical reaction. It wasn't just the horror of watching a story. I think we all felt a physical reaction to the news that was unfolding before our very eyes.
Yeah, I remember calling my wife back in Berkeley, California. Had young kids at the time. Everybody was waking everybody else up in California. How did you spend that day? Where was your family?
Well, the first person I called once it became clear what was happening is I called my husband, who was a fellow journalist who also worked at CNN. We had that moment, you need to hear your loved one's voice just to ground yourself, right? Like, are you kidding me? Am I seeing what I'm seeing? Are you seeing what I'm seeing? And to have that human connection. And then he was on his way into the office. And then what I did is I just, once you get over that feeling of, that physical feeling of this is different than anything we have ever seen in our lifetime, then the work begins. The work kicks in. It's what happens at CNN is you go into 24-hour news coverage and you have to begin to work 6 to 8 hour anchor shifts. So that was the next step. And the other next step was tuning into what were the plans of the network and how do I insert myself in the possibility of covering this story, not just from the anchor desk, but from wherever that story was going to unfold. In the meantime, the national desk was completely focused on getting every reporter, every correspondent, every news crew up to New York and Pennsylvania, Shanksville, Pennsylvania, where another one of the planes crashed, and Washington, D.C., because those bureaus were going to need every resource imaginable to cover the scale of this story. So wherever I could be, as fast as I could be, which initially was going to be the anchor desk, locked in place, interviewing, prime ministers of small European countries, whoever, eyewitnesses, sources at intelligence agencies, that is really what the next week to 2 weeks was going to be like until it was decided that I would go to Pakistan and eventually to Quetta, which is the border town with Afghanistan, and cover the story from there.
We'll talk about that chapter later, but this was CNN's finest hour, wasn't it, Carol? I mean, I'm not sure most of you quite understood how this would be the pinnacle in some ways of CNN as media, because it was there were the beginnings of blogs, and then of course social media and everything else that's happened in the last quarter century. But this was CNN's moment. Did you guys in Atlanta, did you understand that everybody was watching you?
I think we understood everybody was watching us, but I think CNN in those days took great pride in everybody watching us. CNN had a very high standard of vetting information before it went on the air. I came from ABC News, the network, to CNN, so I had an idea of what the standards were in other places, also very high at the time. But CNN was never cavalier, always cautious about its reporting, and always prideful of the deep sources and the deep bench of talent that it had at the network. And so I think it lived and breathed for this moment. And it wasn't out of a sense of ego or commercialism. It was out of a sense of deep responsibility and history rooted in the network, what Ted Turner had infused in the CNN culture, that the news is the star. And it was a privilege for any one individual to participate in that kind of philosophy, to be in a place where we covered the news and that's all we did. So it wasn't intimidating. That was the moment that CNN lived for. It's why it existed at the time. And it wasn't a moment where people even thought twice about what the network was capable of. It was going to outshine every competitor in covering this story. We had more resources, more people, more experience in live breaking news, arguably than any other network, maybe short of the BBC. But I have to tell you, in my reporting assignments overseas, it was CNN who was escorted to the front row. It was CNN who got the first exclusive interview after the press conference. At the time, the world understood the global impact between CNN Domestic and CNN International and all of its sister networks, CNN Headline News and so forth, the impact that CNN had on a global conversation.
You talk about CNN living and breathing for this moment. What about a certain journalist, Carol Lynn, who, as I said earlier, was the first journalist to break the news? Was this your moment? Were you living and breathing for this moment, not just to be so much in the limelight? I mean, obviously, it wasn't an ideal opportunity, but then afterwards to be sent to Afghanistan and the Pakistan border, was this something that you lived and breathed for as a career journalist?
100%, Andrew. This is what I was wired to do. It's what I always wanted to do, at the exclusion of many other things in my life that I probably should have been paying more attention to. It's not an unusual sacrifice for a journalist or a female journalist to make. So I don't stand alone in that. But I think in writing this book, I have to be really candid with you. It was an inflection point in my own personal life, in a marriage that was tested by the news. We were two journalists who were deeply in love with each other, and it was the news that brought us together. And in many ways, it was the news that was tearing us apart. And at this point in 9/11 was a time where we were having to make decisions about our marriage and whether to have a family. And at the same time, all I wanted to do was go. Let's go. Let's do this story. I'll stay as long as I can. I'll do as much as I can. That's all I knew. And I think that makes maybe for a very successful journalist, but it doesn't necessarily make for a very whole person. And so
the subtitle of the book is A Memoir of Love and War. Why did 9/11 mark and the moment where your marriage suddenly came under assault? What was it about that event? Was it symbolic or was it literal?
It was literal, Andrew. When you see that level of devastation, there's the physical devastation, right? We saw the collapse of the World Trade Centers. We saw our institutions under attack. The Pentagon was on fire. We saw American heroes take down the terrorists before the plane could reach Washington, D.C. and kill even more people. We saw the physical devastation, but how the story evolved after was the very human story. It was a story of grief and loss and national reckoning. When you see mothers gathered at Ground Zero holding up pictures of their adult children, writing notes on chain link fences, praying every day that they're going to get some news that their child has been found, or at least their body, so that they have something to bury. To see that in your own country is incredibly moving and inspiring. And I don't know what your personal reckoning was, or even if you had one, but for me and for Will and me, it was about living life and maybe even creating life.
But why did it have such a devastating impact on your marriage? For many people, I think 9/11, as you sort of suggested earlier, was the moment where we realized how dependent we were on our loved ones.
Because I think historic events can test us as individuals, and that's where your true character emerges, where I realized for myself that I was selfish because that's what my career demanded me to be. Maybe not selfish, but self-centered. It was about what I wanted and what I could do because it was a job that asked everything of me. So if I had a job that asked everything of me, what was going to be left for people whom I loved? And when they needed something from me, if we were going to have a baby, I was the one who was going to have the baby, right? No one else was going to do that for me. And so you as a journalist, you are drawn into the field in a story that is not only historic and meaningful, but you have the opportunity to represent the people, the Pashtun tribes people who are navigating the politics, the geopolitics of their own countries, right? Of their reactions, their impressions, their stories, of Americans. That to me is something, it's all I knew. So why was 9/11 such a test for me personally? Because I wanted what I wanted, but as a woman, I was the one to give someone else what they needed. And what Will wanted was a child. And it was then or never.
And this was the husband at the time, Will.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's a private struggle for most people. It's not something that a lot of journalists talk about. We are trained to distance ourselves from the story, and sometimes through that process, we distance ourselves from ourselves. Writing was a way for me to really understand why I made the choices that I made and whether I would have made different choices. And I think that an event like 9/11 for each of us individually, if not just privately, demands that of us.
We had a few years ago, I had Clarissa Ward on the show, who wrote a very
Terrific book
moving
on it.
book about her own experience in Syria. I'm also an old friend of Maria Ressa, who I'm sure you knew or know very well, who was, I think she was a CNN journalist on
Yes.
9/11. Now she's a free speech activist in the Philippines. She won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago. Is there a particular pressure, Carol, for female journalists like yourself, Ward, Ressa, all remarkably distinguished journalists, but who perhaps had pressures that the typical male journalist at CNN wouldn't have had, a Jake Tapper, for example, or even an Anderson Cooper?
I think Anderson's being a lot more vocal about the choices that he's making in terms of how he's having children and raising a family. And I can't speak, I don't represent all female journalists, but I can speak from my own experience and the reality of what it takes to leave on a dime and go to places where it's dangerous and you're not going to be in communication with people and you're going to have to make decisions on the fly. And you are putting yourself at risk for the story, which means, in essence, you're putting yourself at risk for your employer, right? So you have to ask, at the time, you don't ask yourself why you do it, you just do it. There's like a hidden drive. But the reality is, and I can't explain it, Andrew, because I've seen it through family life. I don't know why, no matter how successful I am, no matter how much of a badass I am, no matter how many times I've escaped death or been shot at, the fact of the matter is I'm the one who carries the social load at home. And that is a hard reality for a lot of women, and how well we do it, how much we do it, how often we do it, largely can shape our personal relationships. I mean, I was married to, Will was just an outstanding person in so many ways, a bit of a character, and trust me, we had our own marital issues. I'm married to another man who is just an exceptional partner, but it doesn't subtract from the responsibilities that I have. And I have those responsibilities in part because I accept them, but in part because society, it's how I've been socialized. We as women are socialized to take a certain role in the family. And I can't escape that. I'm a terrible cook. I didn't think I was going to be a mother. I didn't know how to hold a baby. But circumstances forced me to learn and forced me to find the different kinds of joys that a job wouldn't give me. And it's so funny talking to you, Andrew, about this because, you know, when I wrote, I was really thinking of women like myself as the core audience. And I was delighted and very curious when you asked me to come on your
well, it's an
show.
honor, Carol. I'm thrilled you're on. When I talked to Clarissa a few years ago, her book was in many ways about her mother, or about her relationship with her mother. I'm not suggesting that women only write about their relations with their mothers, often with their fathers too, just as men do. But I know your book, When News Breaks, is not just about you and your life. It's also about your family. Tell me about your parents and how they appear in this narrative.
My parents were immigrants from China, forced immigrants, intellectual immigrants who came. My father came to get his PhD and with every intention of going back to his small port city in southern China. He promised to wed a young woman much younger than he. She was only my mother was only 16 at the time when she was promised to my father to be his wife. And when China fell to the communists, he was earning his PhD at USC and then quickly moved to get my mother out of mainland China. She was one of the last people to leave China. And so their immigrant experience was twofold for me. One is that my father adopted a much more Americanized version of you can be anything you want to be in this country. You just have to learn. You have to know how to acquire knowledge. But my mother was much more of a pragmatist. She realized, whether it was through watching media or whether it was her own experiences navigating a very white world at the time in Southern California, that things don't come easily, that that other people's opinions will determine your fate. And in so many ways that played out through the book. And in her case, what she wanted me to be was to be compliant, to assimilate. And that was her language to keep her daughter safe. If you fit in, you blend in, and you meet other people's expectations, you will have an easier life. My father thought differently. And so, he died when I was relatively young and very early in my career, did not really see how my career blossomed. But my mother just warned me that words will never love me back, and that television was always going to be a cautionary tale for me because I would never fit in. That there was only room for one Chinese American journalist, and that was Connie Chung. But to be number two was to be ill-fated. And a lot of my career was about proving her wrong.
Do you think there's an element of, sometimes with these very awkward relations between mothers and daughters, my sense is, and maybe it's wrong, is there's a degree of envy and competition. And when mothers take it out on their more dynamic daughters who have become very worldly, and they haven't, maybe even if they wouldn't acknowledge it, there's an element of envy.
I think for her, it was just pragmatism. Seeing is believing. And what she saw when I was very little was not very impressive. She thought I was a very ugly baby. She thought
She said that? She told you that?
Oh, yes. I found a photo of a baby with a very large head and very squinty eyes. And I said, "Who's this?" And she laughed and said, "Well, that's you. We didn't think you were a very ugly baby, but you're prettier now." But she never said by what degree, right? So it was about grounding me, Andrew. I don't think it was envy. I think she just thought, you know what, you're a plain looking girl from an immigrant family in a country that values beauty and blondness and whiteness and a golden aura. And that is not something you're going to have, Carol. So you need to think practically. You need to think about who you're going to marry. You need to think about going into the sciences, because that's something that Americans can accept in an Asian woman. And so I think in the long run, it wasn't cruel. It felt cruel at the time, but it was her just wanting me to be safe, wanting me to have a safe life was better than a good life, was better than a great life. And I wanted a great life. So there was a lot of rebellion and a lot of trying to prove her wrong. And then when things began to break and collapse, it was me thinking, maybe she was right after all. What if bad things always happen, even if you're a good person? And I think that's part of the journey, right? Of seeing yourself through a life where you reach for the things that you cannot see and that you can only hope for. But that was not going to be her immigrant journey. Her immigrant journey was about pursuing safety.
The book is a personal journey, but it's also obviously about 9/11. It seems as if on September the 11th, 2001, the personal and the political came together. It was the pinnacle and in some ways the end of the American dream. In the last 25 years, everything seems to have become more and more broken in the United States. Is this political and personal narrative, is it intertwined in your own personal narrative? In other words, your ups and downs, are they synonymous with the ups and downs of the United States? Because what you're talking about in terms of your, perhaps what we might call your disagreement with your mother, is a disagreement about the American dream, which itself has come under assault in the quarter century since 9/11.
The American dream has to change, Andrew, because I think the things that my parents reached for no longer exist, are not accessible. And I think that echoing that narrative of 2.4 kids and, you know, a car and a chicken in a pod and a house for every family is not going to happen for everyone, and not as it happened for my parents, and maybe even not that it as it happened for me. And chasing something that no longer exists is only going to lead to turmoil. And that's what we're seeing. But it doesn't mean that life in America can't be what we dream it could be. I think that dream has to change. And I think we have to realize and not sleepwalk to the things that are happening around us. You know, to talk about alternative facts as something that's actually real. I mean, alternative opinions, fine. But the truth is the truth, and the facts are the facts. And I was so blessed to have a career that was rooted in that discipline. I don't mean to sound all, you know, noble, because journalism was far from perfect throughout its history. But, you know, when you talk about the American dream, I think we have to think differently about what's happening around us. And I think you know, my parents did not feel entitled. I don't think an immigrant mentality is about entitlement. Like, well, I deserve to have this just because I'm here. And I think it would be great to think about our immigrant parents and how they thought about their journey. They felt lucky. They felt blessed. They worked hard, and life was not perfect in the 1960s for people of color. But they managed to build bit by bit, and they managed to invest in their future, which is what they saw through their children. And in that way, their life was simple. The rules were a lot more simple. I think, you know, I see a lot of entitlement. I saw it through the pandemic when I worked in county government and emergency services.
That was in Los Angeles or in Southern California.
Yeah. I worked in crisis communications throughout the pandemic for the county of LA. And, you know, this refusal to believe in the collective effort, the collective good, did a lot of harm. A lot of people died because people refused to acknowledge their individual role in the greater good. And now I'm getting all preachy, so I apologize for that. But I feel strongly when you asked me about my parents and their work ethic and their point of view about why they were here and what they were going to accomplish was within a certain reality, that they accepted what they could do, and they accepted what they would never have. They could never go back to China. They knew that. They lost everything. They understood that. But it didn't stop them from trying to just brick and mortar it little by little and earn their place into a society and provide a better life for their children. And it was as simple as that for them. And I don't see enough of that today.
Carol, what did the writing of this book and your life over the last 25 years in and out of journalism, what does it teach us, not just about the American dream, but about individual agency in history? Here we have this event, as you know, when you were in Atlanta, suddenly out the blue on a slow news day when nothing was happening. Michael Jordan was once again a headline news, even though he wasn't doing anything. Suddenly there was this world historic event which changed everything, both in America and around the world. What does it teach us about the role of human agency and structural factors in history? Are we, in a way, for better or worse, are we prisoners of events that we can't control? So just as we might like to think that we make history and we make our own history, ultimately it's made by Muhammad Atta or others who we have nothing to do with.
Well, what you're describing, Andrew, is a sense of victimization. Those are my words. That's how I'm hearing you.
No, it isn't. It's not I'm not making a cultural or a political point. I'm just asking a question about stuff happens that we can't control, and it shapes us, even if we like to think that we control our own fates.
Yeah. Okay. So let me say this. I think that we cannot control what's going to happen. We don't know what's going to happen, but we are shaped by the consequences of our decisions when they happen. And that's where we take agency. I think that's really important. I think to understand that news is going to break, and and more often than not, it's never going to be good. There are going to be events in our life that are going to break us. But the decision point is, what do you do with that information? What do you do with that experience or that knowledge? And I think we are the consequences of the decisions we make. We're seeing that politically in our country, for better or worse, depends on your point of view. And so I would like to believe that we still have choice. We still live in a democracy, and we need to be conscious of the decisions we make at the ballot box, right down to in our community, how we listen to one another. How do we understand why our neighbors feel as they do, and not be absolutists? I know people who walk by homes that have an American flag outside, flying outside, and they're just like, ugh, because they think it's some kind of political statement of ownership. And I said, don't be ridiculous. It's the American flag. Don't give this idea of ownership or agency to evil forces. It is the American flag, nothing more, nothing less. And you don't know what you don't know. And I think we live in a society where we think we know what we don't know. But if you really ask yourself, we don't know. So why don't we listen? Why don't we ask questions? Why don't we have empathy? Try to have some understanding, try to bring some intellectualism to the conversation, and a little less democratization just because you have a voice, but come to the table and let's talk. And we're trying to do that more in our own personal life, to talk to people who have different points of views, and have a better understanding of where that comes from, because otherwise we will not be the United States.
Carol, do you have any regrets yourself? You've written this book about the last 25 years, or your own life, which in a way began in 9/11, but of course anything is that's anything but true. Really, you were formed before 9/11. You just happened to have this remarkable experience of being the first journalist to broadcast what happened. If you were living the last 25 years again, would anything be different, or don't you think in those terms?
I think writing this has forced me to think in those terms. I think the thing that I would do differently, Andrew, is that I would value my individual relationships more. I would take more time to pause. You mentioned Clarissa Ward, and I don't know her personally, but I know lots of people who know her. I've read her book, and my sense of her is she is a woman who's managed to be accomplished, consumed by the work when she needs to be, but she's someone who takes the time to pause and listen on a personal level. And I think I was so ill-equipped for that. I think I was motivated by forces that I didn't recognize at the time. I loved the news, but I think I loved the news for all the wrong reasons. And so if I had to do it over again, and I think I would still do it the same, but I think I would be much more present and intentional in the life I already had, and not just want things for the sake of wanting them or saying what's next.
In a way, everything's changed, and in a way, nothing's changed. The headlines over the last week have been about deadly border fighting breaking out between Pakistan and Afghanistan. There was an angry Afghan immigrant who assassinated or tried to assassinate a couple of National Guards in Washington, D.C. a couple of weeks ago. You went to Afghanistan and Pakistan after 9/11. Has anything really changed in terms of these catastrophic wars that America was sucked into in Afghanistan, obviously Iraq, and this kind of Cold War, I guess, that existed on the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan for the last 25 years?
The answer is no. I think those conflicts are always going to happen because the conflicts are rooted in a tribal culture that dates back centuries. What has changed is the consequence of the the geopolitics around it, which makes these conflicts that much more dangerous. So whether it's a conflict on the Pakistani-Afghan border, or whether we're talking about Israel and Gaza, it is the same. It's the rippling consequences. I think what also hasn't changed is how we cover these stories. It is very different to read these stories than it is to actually meet the people, travel to these places, and just walk the streets and into the local cafes and ask questions. Obviously, the focus is on the conflict areas, but around these conflict areas are towns and villages and businesses and other places where you can ask the questions of why this is happening and who are these people and where are the areas of interest that intersect. And that's where the most fascinating conversations occur. And when I was reporting overseas, I always made a point of going into a situation, whether it was the Second Intifada in the Middle East or whether it was post 9/11 Central Asia. I wanted to know more about the people, what made them tick, and what were their opinions about what was happening around them. And those are the times where you add the humanity to the story. I don't think you see much of that. And if you note, when you watch CNN Domestic, at least this is what I'm noticing, where are the correspondents? So you still see them on CNN International, but you have to make a great effort if you live in the United States to try to find CNN International as a channel to watch. So you've got CNN Domestic that has completely leaned toward opinion and panel discussion. You don't have the correspondents, boots on the ground, bringing you those stories of humanity. You see a little bit on Scripps News. Jason Bellini, their international correspondent, tells these kinds of stories. But until we connect as human beings and understand who are these people versus these anonymous suicide bombers or one attack and another, until we try to make an effort as Americans to understand the culture, the people, the history, we're never going to know the true story. We're never going to know the whole story. And the situation then spirals and becomes that much more dangerous.
Carol, finally, the wonderful title of your book, When News Breaks. Of course, it was about the breaking news of 9/11, but it's also a story about how the news industry has been broken over the last quarter century by particularly the digital revolution. It was 9/11, for better or worse, was CNN's finest hour. Ever since then, we've had blogging and social media. We have a president who spends most of his time on social media criticizing mainstream journalists, picking on them. Even your ex-colleague, Jake Tapper, came to another CNN's journalist, Caitlin Collins' defense after a recent Donald Trump attack. Has the news industry been broken over the last 25 years? You've had a front row seat on it.
I don't think it's broken, but I think it's evolving. There are parts of it that are broken, certainly. I think, we don't know who to trust. We don't know who to trust anymore. CNN was the most trusted name in news, and I don't know, that's no longer the case. And I think I am all for democracy. I am all for
But they're
voices.
the same people. I mean, you were there in 2001. It seems to me, Wolf Blitzer was there. Anderson Cooper was there. Jake Tapper was probably there. They're the same people. So why don't we trust CNN journalists when they're the ones who haven't really? It's us who have changed, not them, isn't it?
It's us and the media construct in general. I think we need to be more transparent. We should have been more transparent about how we collect the news, vet the news, and report the news. I don't think people really understand the standards and practices of the industry as it was. Certainly, the cult of personality. So you've mentioned the biggest personalities at the network, but the people who are really the foot soldiers in an organization like CNN are the producers and correspondents and crews that are out in the field. The public doesn't understand that. And so, we've gotten into this cyclone of opinion, and that is no longer being differentiated. It used to be, even at CNN, that Crossfire was the show where you had news that was opinion, but it was clearly branded as such, and everything else met a very specific new standard of neutrality, almost to an irritating point. Sometimes things just are the way they are. We had a vice president of standards and practices who regularly called if he felt that my interviews were what he considered to be biased. I don't think you see that anymore. It's a free-for-all of personalities, many of them very qualified, but that didn't happen back in 2001. It was very clear to the audience what was editorial opinion and what was personality driven. And then all of a sudden, news became infotainment and clickbait, and the internet, though we benefit because you and I are talking, in the digital age this way, but it is a democratization of voices that democratizes information, and not all information is equal. Some of it's not even information. And now we have concerns about AI. So in that sense, I think the industry is broken because it is not, the audience is asking for transparency, and the construct of how news is delivered doesn't provide for that.
Well, there you have it. Fascinating conversation. When News Breaks by Carol Lynn, very distinguished journalist. The first journalist in the world to really break the 9/11 story when she was reporting for CNN. Congratulations, Carol, on a wonderful new book, both personal and political, about a story that isn't going away, the breaking not just of 9/11 news, but the breaking of the news industry in broad terms, and our lack of trust in networks now like CNN. Thank you so much, Carol, and congratulations on the new book. Wonderful conversation.
Thank you, Andrew.